Bom dia a todos. Nós iniciamos a nossa sessão dessa manhã com a palestra do professor Barry Smith. I introduce Professor Barry Smith from State University of New York at Buffalo, USA, our invited speaker of morning section. Our invited speakers were carefully chosen because of their leading role on foundational issues in ontology research, and we believe that they both, with their experience, can bring important contributions to Brazilian research community. Specifically, Professor Barry Smith is involved both in theoretical issues of ontological research and in development of biological ontology. He is the principal scientist in National Center of Biomedical Ontology, a member of Scientific Advisory Board of the Gene Ontology Consortium. His talk today is about ontology science and ontology engineering. Professor Barry Smith, you are welcome to Brazil and to this meeting.
So thank you to you all. Thank you to the organizers. This is a wonderful meeting. I'm very impressed with the enthusiasm, and I'm looking forward to a great future for ontology in Brazil. Let me say, first of all, something about myself. I started as a philosopher. My dissertation in 1975 is on the topic of ontology. And I worked as a philosopher for about 15, 20 years, and then I met Nicola Guarino. And as a result of my interaction with Nicola and with the people in the engineering world, which he introduced me to, I gradually realized that philosophy can be useful. And so I ceased to be a philosopher and I became an ontologist. And I see ontology as a new science. So in the 19th century, psychology was still a part of philosophy. But at the turn of the 20th century, psychology became an independent science in its own right. So it was freed from the mothership of philosophy and became a part of the university with buildings and professors and meetings and journals of its own. Now gradually, ontology, similarly, is becoming a part of the university with buildings and professors and meetings like this one and journals like the Applied Ontology Journal of its own. And it may be that Nicola is the first ontologist, I don't know. In 2002, I started working with biomedical ontologists. And biomedicine is interesting because independently of work in knowledge engineering, independently of work in artificial intelligence, independently of the kind of work which Nicola has been responsible for, biologists reinvented ontology. This occurred as a result of the fact that the grandfather of the gene ontology, a man called Michael Ashburner, was annoyed by the lack of terminological resources for describing his experimental data in biology. And very quickly he wrote down a long list of terms that he needed in order to have a systematic, consistent way of representing these data. And these were data about gene products, proteins primarily. And he called this list of terms the gene ontology. He didn't know what an ontology was. He thought the word was a nice word. And the original version of the gene ontology was an immediate success. So it captured the imagination of a whole series of biological communities studying proteins, their functions, their cellular locations, the biological processes they contribute to in a variety of different kinds of organisms, flies, mouse, yeast, and so on. The gene ontology, in its initial instantiation, around about 1999, was, as I say, tremendously successful. It was also horrendously bad when measured by the understanding of ontology that we have today. Now, I'm involved in the gene ontology. I became involved in 2002. I invited Michael Ashburner to a conference on the gene ontology, at which my own talk was called Stop. So the gene ontology is called Go. My talk was called STOP, which is an acronym for Smart Terminology Through Ontological Principles. Michael Ashburner was attacked in this talk, and he really liked it. So he is somebody who likes to be criticized, and as a result, he asked me to become involved in further development of the gene ontology, and since then, I've become involved also in the development of other ontologies, including the ones listed here. So the protein ontology, the infectious disease ontology, which I will talk about this morning. And all of these ontologies are now collected together in something called the OBO Foundry, which I will talk about primarily in the workshop on Thursday. Now, in part because of my interaction with the gene ontology, the NCBO was founded by the NIH in 2005. And this is a very large multi-site consortium of clinical researchers, biologists, and computer engineers, and me, who are working on demonstrating that the usefulness of ontology in biology, primarily by focusing on software issues. I am responsible for dissemination and ontology best practices within the framework of the NCBO. Another interesting, very recent development is that we are organizing next year the world's first conference on biomedical ontology taken as a whole. And this will take place in Buffalo next July. And you're all welcome. And this URL doesn't work yet, but it will work within a couple of days. So now these are some example ontologies which I'm closely involved in developing, marshalling, encouraging. Basic formal ontology I will talk about a little bit today because this too interrelates with the talk which Nicola gave yesterday. Then there is an anatomy ontology, an environment ontology, an anatomy ontology for humans. IDO, I mentioned already. The ontology for biomedical investigations is an ontology for describing experiments, including design, protocol, equipment, results, publications, funding, ethics, licensing, and so forth. It's a very, very large group ontology, which has been very successful already, even though it's only about a year old. And part of it is an ontology for clinical trials. Then we have a phenotype ontology, we have the relation ontology, and there are many more such ontologies within the framework of the Foundry. And the idea is that these ontologies should be built in such a way that they work together. Now, this is a very, very difficult cultural, political, sociological, psychological, psychiatric, sometimes criminal endeavor, because these are biologists and clinical people, and they all have different terminological backgrounds. They all have different expectations of terminology. They have different ways in which they understand their own property rights over their data. They have different ethics issues with regard to the use of their data. And to convince them that it would be good to standardize on terminology, even in spite of all of these differences, is, from the perspective of, I think, everyone in this room, an obvious benefit for them, but they have no understanding of why that would be a benefit, because they're focused on their own specific disciplinary concerns, and those disciplinary concerns are rooted in old-fashioned ways of using terminology. Now, gradually, they are realizing that they have many kinds of data which they increasingly need to use in their work. So in the clinical context, we have increasingly more and more kinds of data of a biological kind. High throughput experimental data deriving from gene arrays, from protein chips, from a whole series of new methodologies, MRI imaging data, and so forth. And at the moment, these data are siloed. That is to say, the people with the protein chip data live in one building and they do it their way, and the people with the imaging data live in another building and they do it their way, and there is really no way in which those different kinds of data can ever talk to each other. And the idea behind the Obo Foundry and behind this framework of interoperable ontologies is that we should try and solve this silo problem. Now, I think that ontology is a possible solution to the silo problem. It's a very difficult problem, and it's going to get worse. The more computers enter into our scientific and medical lives, the more the silo problem becomes a danger. The silo problem is a danger because all of these different kinds of data truly are different kinds of data. They do not work easily together. But the ontology is a possible solution. I believe that it is the only possible solution. But even I am not convinced that it is a solution. So if we have a solution, then it's ontology. But maybe we don't have a solution. Maybe we are condemned to live in a world in which data is siloed forever. But we need to try and find a solution, and ontology is our best, indeed our only bet. However, ontology is also a danger. And this is because there are many ontologies. So this is I think the main lesson that we got from the discussion of Nicola's talk and from the panel session, the first panel session yesterday. There are too many ontologies. There are 240 different Brazilian guitar ontologies, for instance. Or anyway, there are dozens. There are too many ontologies. And if we have too many ontologies, then ontology itself contributes to the silo problem. So instead of being a solution to the problem, ontology makes the problem worse. And so Nicola is right when he says, well, maybe we need some authority. So he did not say this in a loud voice. We need to have an authority which will enforce orthogonality of ontologies. One ontology for proteins, please. Not 237 ontologies for proteins, just one ontology for proteins. Now that, too, is a very difficult problem. Everybody wants their own protein ontology. There is an Australian group which has created an ontology called the Protein Ontology. There is a group which I belong, which has created an ontology called Protein Ontology. We want to work with the Australians to create one really good protein ontology. The Australians do not answer our emails. That we've tried, we've offered them money, we've invited them. They do not answer. Now that is not science. I will discuss this kind of issue later on. So, why is the silo problem a problem? Why shouldn't we have silos? Big data silos, like power stations, full of data. Why is that bad? The reason it's bad is because if the silos are developed separately by different people with their own private, local terminologies or data schemas or ways of formatting their data, we can't find the data. We have no idea what's in those silos because they were built locally. Of course, we can't either reason with the data. If we're going to reason with data from imaging and from proteins, we need to be able to put those data together in logic And if we're going to do that, then we need to have a way of understanding how the logic of the terminology used over here works with the logic of the terminology over there. And as long as data is siloed, this will be difficult, if not impossible. But there's an even worse problem. If you silo your data, what this means is that you do an experiment. Maybe you get 100 people to help you carry out the experiment. You collect a lot of data. You have a lot of Excel spreadsheets in which you collect your data, and you do your statistical studies of the data. And then 3 years later, you go back to your Excel spreadsheets and you can't understand your own data because you can't remember what you meant by MGMT/3*7. You have no idea because you siloed your own data. You did not use a standard consensus terminology. You made something up. So, it's clear that to solve the silo problem, medical researchers need the help of ontology engineers. We can't do reasoning without very powerful ontology reasoning systems, and we can't do cross-domain reasoning unless we have some kind of consensus-based common terminologies which cross these domains and which capture the logical content of the data which is collected by the people researching in those different domains. So we need the help of ontology engineers. But the problem is that ontology engineers like making up new ontologies. Indeed, they get money from making up new ontologies. And so they are the danger. So we need their help, but they need careful control, adult supervision. Now, this is a very simple illustration of how ontologies help with the finding problem. So, let's suppose that you are studying mouse brains, or you're studying mouse anatomy data, and you have a lot of journal articles of your domain, or you have a lot of statements deriving from abstracts of journal articles. And in these statements, you find terms like brain, hindbrain, rhombomer. Now, you're interested in brains. If you just look for the string brain, you will find 20 statements. But you're interested in brains. That means you're also interested in hindbrains and in rhombomers. Rhombomers are a special kind of a special part of the hindbrain, and the hindbrain is a special part of the brain. The ontology will tell you that hindbrain and rhombomer are part of the brain. And if you set up your query using the ontology, then you will get 45 statements which are relevant to your concerns. If you set up your query without the ontology, you will only get the string match corresponding to brain results. This is a very simple illustration of how the ontology can help. You can do much more than just capture all the relevant parts, but in capturing the relevant parts, you get more of what you want. As a result of this recognition that we need the help of ontology in order to solve a number of different aspects of the silo problem, research in ontology and use of ontology in research in the medical arena has exploded. So I think it's increased since the year 2000 by 1,700%, measured by number of occurrences in PubMed. So this is, the legend here is as follows. Already in 1998, there were around 170 publications which were referencing controlled vocabularies. This is what the yellow means. And there were about 20 publications using the ontology word. By 2007, there were 400 and something publications referencing controlled vocabularies, but now there are something like 600 publications referencing ontologies and maybe 30 publications which use both of those expressions. So, the biologists need help from ontology engineers. Biomedical researchers need help from ontology engineers. Biologists need help because this is what biology looks like today. You can't do biology anymore just by looking at mice and counting the number of legs. You have to work with these things. Now, human beings find it very difficult to work with these things for obvious reasons. And the gene ontology was, in fact, created primarily to make the information in these kinds of sequence data structures accessible to biologists of the more human kind. The gene ontology provides the answers to 3 types of questions. So if you have a gene array which tells you that there is some gene product functioning in a certain way in a given cell, then you want to know 3 things. You want to know what part of the cell is involved, what molecular function is being exercised, and what biological process does that function contribute to. The gene ontology provides you with a controlled vocabulary, a list of terms, which are standardized kinds of answers to these questions. And the gene ontology has been used now by thousands of biologists researching gene products, and they've associated gene ontology terms with a million proteins, more than a million proteins by now, in a very systematic way, so that people can take a biological sample, they can analyze the chemical constituents of that biological sample, and then using the gene ontology, they can draw a whole series of inferences about the kinds of biological processes, the kinds of molecular functions and so forth, within which the chemical constituents of that particular biological sample, which may be a tumor, for instance, taken from a human being, are typically involved. And this has now become a standard technique of medical research. You study biological samples, you get their chemical composition, and you use the gene ontology in order to work out how that chemical composition is related to standard biological phenomena. The gene ontology looks like this. This is a very small fragment. There are, in fact, 3 ontologies. One ontology is an ontology of cellular components. So this, for instance, tells you that the nucleus is a part of the intercellular, which is a part of the cell, which is a cellular component. Then we have the molecular function ontology, which tells us that transcription factor activity is a kind of DNA binding, which is a kind of nucleic acid binding, which is a kind of binding, which is a kind of molecular function. And this tells us, this is the biological process ontology, and this tells us that adaxial, abaxial axis specification is a part of adaxial-abaxial pattern formation, which is a kind of pattern specification, which is a kind of development, which is a biological process. So there are 25,000 or so such nodes within the gene ontology, between which relations are defined, which we can use to reason about biological phenomena. And the gene ontology is being used now also to annotate or tag biomedical literature. So whenever you get a protein referred to in a piece of biological literature, there are likely to be biological curators who associate the corresponding gene ontology terms with that protein, according to what is claimed in that piece of scientific literature about that protein, and then that annotation becomes part of an annotation database which is used by thousands of other researchers who are interested in that particular protein or in those particular biological processes. Now the idea is that because the gene ontology is the ontology for molecular functions and the ontology for cellular components and the ontology for biological processes, which is used by tens of thousands of different researchers, it serves as a kind of common switchboard connecting thousands of different databases. The very same term, sphingolipid transporter activity, is used by the database people working on mouse ecotopes and by people working on glycol, and by people working on diabetics, and by people working on glucose. And they annotate their data using the same gene ontology terms, and the data thereby becomes connected together in a very useful way, it turns out. So the silo problem is hereby solved, or at least we have a partial solution to the silo problem, because we're linking the databases together in ways which human biologists find useful. Now that work involves care being taken by the people building the databases to use the gene ontology when they're building their database schemas. And many of them are doing that because they see that they want to be part of this game. This is where the success, the gene ontology is, by at least one order of magnitude, the most successful ontology. And I like to compare ontologies with telephone networks. If you buy a new telephone, a new mobile telephone, and it's the best mobile telephone ever, it's made of gold and it's got, I don't know, diamonds inside it, but there are no other subscribers to your network, then you have nothing. Where if you have a crappy old plastic telephone with 2 million subscribers, then you have everything. Now the gene ontology is a crappy old plastic telephone with 2 million subscribers. And that's why it's successful, and it's a snowball effect. The more it's successful, the more people want to use it. The more people use it, the more annotations there are using the gene ontology, the more databases are then no longer siloed. So this is another example. This is male courtship behavior orientation prior to leg tapping and wing vibration. This is a very fly-sounding term. This is a kind of male courtship behavior, which is a kind of reproductive behavior, which is a kind of reproductive process, which is a kind of multicellular process, which is a kind of process. The logic here is rather simple, but the virtues, because of the large number of annotations created using the terms which have this logic, are tremendous. And this is shown also in the high Google rankings that the gene ontology receives. It's shown also in the overwhelming dominance of the gene ontology when it comes to PubMed uses of ontology. So if we look at 2007, these are references to ontology in PubMed. The light blue here is the gene ontology. So in 2007, something like 78% of references to ontology in PubMed are references to the gene ontology. And then the rest are relatively insignificant. So the gene ontology is clearly overwhelming the field when it comes to ontology, and that's because the gene ontology is being used by so many people. So the benefits of the Go are, it's rooted in biology, it's rooted in experiments, because the Go is built by people who are doing biology and who are reading the literature and who are creating terms because they need them to capture the scientific content of the literature. It links people to data and to literature because people can understand the terms in the gene ontology. It links data to data in the way that I described. And it does this across species. It links human data to mouse data and so forth. And across granularities, it links molecular data to cell data to organ data to population data. It links medicine to biological science increasingly. And it allows cumulation of scientific knowledge because we're all using the same terminology. And that means that if people in Sao Paulo are describing mouse courtship behavior using the gene ontology, then what they say will be comparable with what the people in Denver say about mouse courtship behavior because they're both using the same terminology. So what do the ontology engineers say? Let's generalize these benefits to other areas. Let's build another 25 ontologies. But the problem is they use the wrong methodology. So the gene ontology was built by biologists. The ontology engineers are not biologists. For ontology engineers, there is only one standard, and that standard is the software runs on our machines. That's the only thing they're interested in. They're not interested in mice. They're not interested in truth. They're not interested in reality. They're not interested in knowledge in the sense in which scientists understand knowledge. They're interested in making the software run on the machine. That's how they get to sleep at night. Now, it's just as a footnote, it's easier to make simple software run on a machine than it is to make difficult software run on a machine. So, it's easier to write useful, that is to say, run. It's easier to write software if one works with a simplified model. And then they say, and we can't know what reality is like in any case, because we only have our own concepts. We all live in our own solipsistic worlds. This is the kind of thing they say. It's been, ever since I worked with ontology engineers, a constant cause of wonderment, not to say panic, to me, the degree to which ontology engineers are attracted to cheap French philosophy. So to this relativistic, multicultural, postmodern. So what they do is they say, I found a new simplified model on Wednesday. It looks useful. Maybe my software will run. And then a week later, someone else says, I found another simplified model. So you have two ontologies, maybe two ontologies in the same room. And they both maybe even run, but they're both simplified models. And now you have a silo. Because the people who use the ontology over there create one new set of data, and the people using the ontology over there create another. Now this is a bad methodology. And that this methodology is, of course, attractive to engineers, again, because of the money problem. So you don't get money for doing what he's doing, you get money for doing something different. So now we can see why we need to build scientific ontologies. Multiple ontologies only make our data silo problems worse. Not words, but worse. So we need to constrain our ontologies so that they converge. And then what is to serve as constraint? And the answer is reality as revealed by experimentally based science. This is the way in which the gene ontology is built. Biologists are doing experiments and reading experimental literature, and they build the ontology on the basis of the terms they need to be able to capture the results of biological experiments. And they don't care about software. They leave that to someone else. They care about getting the ontology to fit the science. So, how do you do ontology? You follow the principles of ontological realism, which is boring, old, non-French, Aristotelian type philosophy. You find out what the world is like by doing science. Ontology is like science, multidisciplinary. You can't do protein science unless you also do cell science, RNA science, sequence science, and so forth. The science is connected together. It's difficult. And then you build your ontological representations slowly and incrementally and always badly, but always with the possibility of being slightly better tomorrow, in such a way that they are adequate to this world that you discover by doing science, not to some simplified model of this world in your laptop. This is a parable now. In the olden days, people measured lengths using inches and ulnas and perches and king's feet and Swiss feet and leagues of Portugal and varas of Texas and so forth. And then on June 22nd, 1799, in Paris, everything changed. We have the standard meter. I'm not sure that is the standard meter, actually, but let's just assume that this is the standard kilo. Good. We have the standard kilo. Now, just imagine what was involved with creating the standard kilo. It's not enough just to have a lump of metal, is it? you have to have a king, or anyway, an emperor, or somebody like that, who tells everybody that this is how you're going to measure weight henceforth. This is the standard. And the standard is now the International System of Units. And there is only one International System of Units. And there is only one way of measuring length and mass and time and electric current and so forth within the International System of Units. So the International Standard System of Units is a controlled vocabulary because it tells you not just what the units are, but also what the terms are that you have to use. So the use of unit symbols is regulated by precise rules. And it's obvious why this has to be. Because scientific data inside computers needs to be captured in such a way that the data inside those computers can be compared with the data inside those computers. And if everybody uses the same symbol for meter, that is overwhelmingly easier. It forces people into the correct behavior. But the International System of Units is also an ontology. It represents certain universals in reality, namely those universals which are the standardized chunks along measurable dimensions of this reality. The standardization is conventional. Where you chunk length into meters, whether you do it this way or this way, is an arbitrary decision. But once that decision is made, and once everybody is sharing it, then those standardized chunks become much more than just arbitrary. They become a social network good, like a telephone network. So the goal is to provide an analog of the International Standard System of Units for all of the basic dimensions of biology, not just the measurable dimensions, but also the qualitative dimensions, which include, for instance, the different kinds of cellular components, the different kinds of proteins. We want a controlled vocabulary for proteins, and we want an ontological organization underlying that controlled vocabulary, which might be something like the ontological organization depicted here. So the first step in bringing about this this revolution was taken in around 2002 with the creation of the OBO library, which is a library of around 70 ontologies, all of which, or most of which, were created following the same pattern as the gene ontology. And then we created in 2005 the OBO Foundry, which is a subset of the OBO library, consisting of those ontologies which commit to following a set of principles designed to make them interoperable. And these principles are evolving through time, so we are now about to publish chapter 2 of these principles. The strategy is described in a paper in Nature Biotechnology from last year, and the goal, which is an ongoing it's a goal which is realized in an ongoing fashion. That is to say, the OBO Foundry already exists, even though it's in very many ways still a very ramshackle approximation to the vision. But the goal is a suite of controlled structured vocabularies for the annotation of data to support integration and algorithmic process reasoning across the entire domain of biomedicine. And for this to work, all of the ontologies in the Foundry have to be evolved in tandem with each other. So if one ontology changes, then the other ontologies which are neighbors of that ontology need to change correspondingly. And we have strategies for doing this, some of which involve help from ontology engineers. This is a small picture of the very early Foundry. I'll talk more about this in the workshop on Thursday. So the one way of describing it is a homesteading approach. This is the southern continent of America before the Spanish and the Portuguese came. And whoever got to a specific domain first gets to own that domain until someone better comes along. And then we have a king or a pope which it's not me, but it's nearly me, who decides which is better. And basically the principle is that we bully people to do the right thing. This is another view of the same. This is a starting point for the criteria. So all the ontologies have to be open. They have to use a common formal language. They have to be built in collaboration, so no secret ontologies. They have to be maintained as science changes. The most important criterion is the criterion of convergence. There has to be only one protein ontology. Now, to me, that's obvious. And increasingly, it's obvious to other people, but it's a socially difficult problem to institute. So one ontology for each domain brings a whole series of benefits. First of all, there's no need for any of this matching stuff. All of this ontology matching work is work which people have to do because there are too many ontologies. Ontologies must die. So ontology killing, ontology euthanasia is the gospel. There's no need for ontology integration because you only have one ontology. You'd have some work to be done integrating protein ontology with RNA ontology, for instance. But there's no need for mappings. Mappings are expensive, they're fragile, they're never very good, but worst of all, they're impossible to keep up to date because the ontologies which get mapped in biology are changing daily. The gene ontology is updated every night. And if you have mappings between the gene ontology and 400 different ontologies, you're not going to be able to keep those mappings up to date. So, ontology, orthogonality is our best, perhaps our only hope of solving the silo problem. So, why do since orthogonality has all of these benefits, why do computer engineers hate orthogonality? They still misspelled it. Anyway, orthogonality, that's supposed to say. Why do they hate it? They do hate it. So when the idea of orthogonality was first proposed as a principle of the Obo foundry, we thought it was obvious, blindingly obvious. But that was the only principle that people attacked. The ontology engineers attacked it. Now, one reason, of course, is the money reason. They like relativism because relativism means for every project you get a new ontology. I think the reason why they hate it is because the training is bad. Computer scientists are trained to like building software. They're not trained to like building software for a larger purpose. So this is rather like a science faculty in a university which trains physicists to like building equipment. It's not good to build equipment. We may have too much equipment. You should be trained to build equipment to do physics. So, all Obo foundry ontologies work in the same way. We have data, we need to make this data available, so we create a consensus-based ontology for annotating the data. Now, we did this in the infectious disease domain. So we have a group of large infectious disease database organizations for TB, for dengue, for influenza, for malaria. And they all need to annotate this data. And there are many terms that they're going to use over and over again, like pathogen, for instance. They need to annotate the data for a whole series of purposes, and we want to help them make the data comparable and computable by building an infectious disease ontology. How do we do this? Well, we look for those terms which relate to every infectious disease. Terms like carrier, susceptibility, virulence, reservoir, evasion, epidemic, pandemic, and so forth. Every infectious disease uses these terms. We build an ontology of infectious disease using just those disease-neutral terms. We give them logical definitions, and then we work with the dengue and the influenza and the malaria specialists to produce a dengue infectious disease ontology, a malaria infectious disease ontology, an influenza infectious disease ontology, using those terms, plus the disease-specific terms which they need, like mosquito, which they need for their own specific field. So we then create a family of disease and organism-specific ontologies, which we can see as refinements of this IDO core. And the use of the common IDO core guarantees some level of comparability of the data across all of these different communities. Now they love this because they all know that they need an ontology, but they had no way of knowing how to start. And they're not experts in ontology, and they needed guidance, and no one was providing them with this guidance. Now, the trick is to find groups, multiple groups, who will all accept the same guidance. So that the Catholic Church must be large, and the Pope must be powerful for this to work. And in infectious disease, it is working. So we have an IDO ontology, which you can see a little bit of here, and the slides will be mounted on the website so that you can see more of this. And then the IDO also works well with things like the gene ontology, which has a large immunology branch, and immunology is, of course, a very important factor in infectious disease research. It needs to work with the phenotype ontology and so forth. And all of this comes free because IDO is part of the OBO foundry, which means that it's built in such a way that a priori it works well with the other foundry ontologies. Now I'm going to conclude with a thesis. Experimental results are being described in algorithmically useful ways with the help of ontologies like the Go. That's just a fact. Such ontologies are authored and maintained by scientists. Not by engineers, but by scientists to support all of these things. The thesis is these ontologies themselves are a part of science. They are not a part of engineering. Engineering is important, just like equipment building. But it's not why we build ontologies. We don't build ontologies to have more ontologies or shiny ontologies or new ontologies. We build ontologies because ontologies are a part of science. I rest my case.